The museum was quiet that afternoon, the sky outside overcast and heavy. An old man walked alone, slow steps, a faded cap with a forgotten insignia, and eyes that had seen too much. He didn't say a word, just ran his wrinkled hand across the cold steel of the old Sherman tank, like greeting an old friend. Then his sleeve slipped. A faded tattoo appeared, an unfamiliar triangle enclosing a star, flanked by strange numbers. From across the room, a young historian gasped. "That symbol, it's not in any archive," he whispered, stunned. The old man just stood there, silent. But what he carried, what he remembered, would soon rewrite a chapter of forgotten history. His name was Walter Hagan, 91 years old, no family, no military pension, no public records of his service, just a birth certificate, a property deed to a crumbling farm tucked into the hills of western Montana, and a dusty mailbox with no flag. His name never appeared in any veteran registry, no plaques, no medals, not even a paper trail suggesting he'd ever worn a uniform. And yet there he was, standing in the Federal Military Museum, touching a Sherman tank like it had once saved his life. Maybe it had. What caught Elliot's eye that day wasn't just the reverence in Walter's gesture, but what appeared under his rolled-up sleeve, a faded tattoo, a triangle pointing downward, enclosing a five-pointed star, and beneath it, three worn numbers, 231. Elliot wasn't the type to leap to conclusions. He was a historian, methodical, skeptical, but also curious. He'd seen similar geometric symbols in declassified sketches, notations from operations the government once claimed never happened, and that number, 231, nagged at the back of his mind. After Walter left the museum that day, Elliot couldn't let it go. He returned to the archives, dug through box after box of microfilm, forgotten memos, old communiques from the Korean War and early Cold War years. He wasn't looking for Walter Hagan, he was looking for the tattoo, and he found it, or at least something close. In a sealed intelligence memorandum dated March 1952, there was a reference to Unit 231, ghost designation. No names, no locations, just in order to scrub any trace of it from the official records and a red stamp across the page. Deniable operations. Pacific Theater. The file included a sketch, a hand-drawn triangle. Inside it, a single star. No color, no explanation, just that image. Elliot leaned back in his chair and stared at the page for a long time. His mind raced. He cross-referenced everything. Squadron logs, mission reports, field hospital rosters. Nothing. No 231. No unit matching the symbol. No after-action reports. It was as if the entire existence of the unit had been erased, or had never existed at all. That made Walter more than an enigma. It made him a problem, a contradiction, living proof of something the government had worked hard to erase. And yet, there was something in the way Walter had touched that tank, not for show, not for nostalgia. It was ritual, familiar, like the kind of connection only a man who's heard shells screaming overhead and smelled burning metal can have with such a machine. Elliot asked the museum for security footage. They were reluctant at first, but curiosity won out. Together they watched Walter's visit in silence. The camera showed the old man approaching slowly, shoulders hunched slightly, hand trembling as he reached out to the tank. He rested his palm on the armor, closed his eyes, and mouthed something. The footage had no sound, but Elliot didn't need audio to know what it meant. That wasn't a tourist. That wasn't a civilian. That was a soldier saying hello to an old comrade. A few days later, Elliot made the trip out to Montana. The address tied to Walter's museum registration led to a modest wooden farmhouse sitting quietly at the edge of a pine-covered ridge. There was no car in the drive, just a small American flag hanging faded and quiet on the porch. Walter answered the door with the same worn cap on his head. He didn't look surprised to see Elliot. "You're the kid from the museum," he said simply. Elliot nodded. "I saw the tattoo." Walter didn't flinch. He just stepped aside, opened the door, and said, "Might as well come in then." The house was clean but sparse. A wood-burning stove, a kettle humming, one armchair, one bookshelf, no photographs, no medals, nothing that told a story, except Walter himself. "You're not gonna find it," Walter said, pouring them both coffee. "Not in any file, not in any vault. We weren't supposed to exist." Elliot leaned forward. "But you did. I found a reference, Unit 231, Deniable Operations, Pacific Theater, 1952. Walter chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You found the smoke. The fire's long buried." He rolled up his sleeve again, letting Elliot study the tattoo up close this time. "They burned the names, scratched out the missions, but they couldn't erase what we saw, or what we did, and they sure as hell couldn't erase what we lost." Elliot didn't speak. He just listened. Walter's eyes, tired as they were, didn't blink. "I didn't come to that museum for recognition. I came to see if anyone still remembered, even if they didn't know they did." For a moment, neither man said anything. Then Walter added quietly, "That tank, she wasn't just steel. She was the last one to make it back. The only one." Elliot knew right then that this wasn't just a story. It was a buried chapter in the American military legacy, hidden not by accident, but by design. And Walter Hagan was the last living page. Walter didn't raise his voice. He didn't speak for effect. His words came slowly, but clearly, like a man not recalling memories, but reliving them. "There was a village," he said, "North Africa, not on any map, didn't even have a name, just coordinates and a target circle drawn in red. We were told to secure it before someone else did." Elliot sat still, notebook open, pen idle. He didn't dare interrupt. "It was 1952, Walter continued, "but they told us it wasn't happening. The whole thing was pre-theater recon. We were just supposed to observe. Of course, that's not how it went." He glanced at the photograph Elliot had found in the archives, the triangle and star symbol. Walter tapped it with one calloused finger. "We weren't even called a unit. No designation, no patches, just Ghost 231. That's what they whispered in the briefings." He described how they were flown in under night cover, no insignia, no flags, just unmarked fatigues and the assurance that, if captured, you were never ours. "Us is their objective? Reclaim a remote French outpost that had fallen into the hands of a rogue paramilitary force. Officially, the U.S. was not involved. Unofficially, the outpost was guarding a weapons cache America couldn't afford to fall into enemy hands." Walter's voice softened. "It wasn't even about the weapons. It was about who we were told not to be. No ranks, no names, just tasks." He paused, then looked out the window. "That Sherman in your museum, the one I touched. She was ours. I'd know her anywhere." Elliot leaned forward. "You're sure?" "I don't forget armor," Walter said firmly, "especially not the one that saved us." He went on to describe it in detail. Not just the standard specs, the turret rotation, the cannon length, the track type, but the wound that marked it. "There's a bullet hole," he said, "just under the right side of the turret, about the size of a coffee mug. The shell went clean through and hit our gunner, Martinez, in the chest." Elliot frowned. "The museum record says that tank came from a transport depot in Tunisia." Walter raised a hand. "They can say what they want. I remember the blood. Martinez was hit bad. No medics, no evac, just us." He took a breath. "So I did what I could. Tore the lining from my jacket, wadded it up, plugged the hole to stop the wind and dust from suffocating him, wrapped him in what was left of my shirt. I sat up there next to him, hand on the turret, for 9 hours until the shooting stopped." There was no drama in his voice, just memory, raw and exact. "We held that village for 3 days, outnumbered 5-1. No air support, just our crew, 2 rifles, and 1 tank with a hole in her side." Elliot was stunned. "How did you make it out?" Walter gave a thin smile. "We didn't, not all of us. The mission was never officially acknowledged. After the objective was secured, Walter's team waited for extraction. None came. Radio silence. Days turned into weeks. Supplies ran out. Water became mud. Wounds went untreated. 29 days, he said, behind enemy lines. We lost 7 men, buried them ourselves. No markers, just rocks. When they were finally found, by accident, not design, a passing British patrol stumbled on them, emaciated, sunburnt, still guarding the outpost they were never ordered to take. They flew us back in the dead of night. No fanfare. No debrief. No questions. Walter chuckled bitterly. They burned our files the next day. Told us to forget. Told us it never happened. Elliot swallowed. And did you? Walter met his eyes. You ever forget the names of the men who died beside you? I still remember the way Jenkins cried for his mother in his sleep. I remember the smell of oil and cordite. I remember that damn tank, creaking every time we rolled forward like she was groaning with us. There was a long silence. We weren't ghosts out there, he said quietly. We were soldiers. We did what no one else would. And we did it knowing no one would thank us for it. He rubbed the tattoo on his arm. Triangle, star, 231, as if it still held heat. That symbol wasn't a unit marker. It was a warning, a reminder. You don't come back from missions like that the same? Elliot looked down at his notes, hands trembling slightly. Why come to the museum now? After all these years? Walter shrugged. I heard they'd brought in an old Sherman for display. Thought maybe it was her. I had to see. Had to know. And? Walter smiled faintly. It was her. Still scarred. Still standing. His voice dropped to a whisper. I just wanted to say goodbye. After the mission, they told him to forget. No medals, no discharge ceremony, no parade. Walter Hagan returned to American soil not as a hero, but as a no one. A man who had never existed in uniform, never stood in formation, never risked his life in a war that, according to the official record, never happened. They gave him a train ticket. That was it. No questions, no conversation. Just a look from a faceless officer in a gray suit in a single line. Thank you. You'll need to keep quiet. And so he did, for a while. He returned to Montana, to the land his father had worked. A quiet patch of hills, acres of silence, and an old barn that creaked louder than any welcome. There were no reporters waiting, no family left to ask questions, just the mountains and the long winters. People in town knew him as the quiet one. The guy who fixed his own fences, never married, and walked to the post office every Friday like it was a sacred ritual. Some thought he might have been in Korea, maybe Vietnam, but when he spoke, which wasn't often, and mentioned North Africa, 1952, the conversations always turned awkward. We weren't in Africa then, Walter. That war ended years before you say you were there. You must be confused. At Veterans Memorial Services, he stood in the back. When they read off the names of fallen soldiers, he never heard his team's names. Martinez, Jenkins, Owens. Gone, but never officially there. Every year, on what he remembered as the day Martinez died, Walter would drive to a private spot in the woods and light a small fire. He'd sit alone, whisper their names into the flame, and pour a little whiskey into the earth. It was his funeral, his memory, because no one else was holding it. I'm not angry, he once told a local preacher. I just miss them. I miss the cold, weirdly enough. I miss the way metal smells after it's been scorched. I don't need anyone to write my story, but they deserve to be remembered. Over the years, Walter tried, gently, patiently, to speak up. He wrote to the Department of Defense, nothing. He sent a formal inquiry to the Library of Congress, asking only if any records of Unit 231 existed. The response was clinical. No such unit is listed in official archives. He mailed a letter to the National Museum of Military History, including a hand-drawn sketch of the tank, and even a photograph he'd taken of the tattoo on his arm. No reply. He tried one last time, a handwritten letter to his state senator. He never got an answer. Eventually, Walter stopped writing. He didn't give up because he was tired. He gave up because no one was listening. And when silence becomes the only reply, even truth begins to doubt itself. Then years later, he saw the article. A small piece in the local paper. Sherman tank added to Federal Military Museum exhibit. The serial number listed made his breath catch. It was her, the same tank. The one they had nicknamed Clara after Owen's daughter. The one he never met. The one that rolled through smoke and fire, that held their broken bodies together, that became their coffin, their savior, and their witness. That was when Walter decided. No more letters, no more silence. He dressed in the same coat he'd worn all those decades ago. Frayed, patched at the elbows, the lining still missing from where he'd used it to plug that bullet hole. He took the early bus into town, then another to the city, then a train to D.C. It took him 2 days to reach the museum. No appointment, no announcement. He walked through the front entrance alone, like he always had. Past the jets, past the war murals, until he saw her, Clara, restored, painted, polished, but still hers. He stepped past the velvet rope. No guard stopped him. No one even looked. And he reached out like someone greeting an old friend at a graveside. He touched the steel, cold, silent, familiar. And then he whispered, just one name, Martinez. Elliot couldn't sleep. After his visit to Walter's cabin, the historian returned home with a notebook full of contradictions and a gut feeling that refused to settle. The tattoo, the tank, the missing names, and most of all, the way Walter spoke with clarity that time could not erode. Historians are trained to chase sources, not feelings. But this was different. Elliot had contacts, old professors who now worked with the Pentagon's archival division, a few favors owed in the Office of Military Records. So, under the guise of academic research, he started digging. What began as late-night curiosity turned into full-blown obsession. He requested access to declassified microfilm reels from the 1950s, official communiques, inventory reports, troop movements in North Africa, even naval shipping logs. Nothing. No Unit 231. No reports of unmarked operations in Tunisia or Algeria. No mention of an American Sherman deployed in that sector during 1952. But one night around 2 a.m., buried deep inside an off-site intelligence brief from March of that year, he found a page labeled Black Shadow, Operational Pilot Unit, Access Level Restricted Echo. There was no official unit name. Just a short, hand-typed paragraph. As of March 12th, redacted, Ghost Group 231 continues perimeter hold on disputed ground. Unit is not formally acknowledged. Orders issued under discretion of Strategic Intelligence Command. All references to Black Shadow are to be purged post-engagement. No personnel identifications to be logged. Field assets are non-returnable. Objective is containment and retrieval. But that wasn't what made Elliot's pulse spike. Attached to the document, barely legible, was a hand-drawn insignia, a triangle, a star inside it, and underneath, 231. He stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "It's real." The following morning, Elliot printed the document and walked straight into the office of the museum's Director of Collections, Dr. Henry Arliss, a seasoned, pragmatic man known for avoiding controversial exhibits. "This better be good," Arliss said, without looking up. Elliot placed the page on his desk and replied, "I think one of our visitors rewrote history last week." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Arliss had experienced in his 20 years of museum work. He was skeptical, of course. What historian wouldn't be? But Elliot's voice carried conviction, the kind that doesn't come from theory, but from truth you've seen with your own eyes. They reviewed the visitor footage, watched Walter approach the Sherman, zoomed in on the tattoo, matched it against the recovered insignia. It was identical. Within 48 hours, the museum made contact with the Department of Defense, submitting a formal inquiry with attached evidence. The declassified document, the footage, and a transcript of Elliot's field notes from his visit with Walter. No response. 3 days passed, then 4. On the 5th morning, 2 unmarked black SUVs pulled into the museum's service entrance. The men who stepped out weren't in uniform, but everything about them was military. Clean-cut, stone-faced, polished shoes, suits that looked like they'd never wrinkled. They asked for Elliot by name. He brought them to the Sherman. They asked him to recount everything. He did. When they asked how he found the file, he gave them a name. That person would likely never speak to him again. They didn't comment. They simply nodded, took notes, and left. The next day, they visited Walter. Walter didn't seem surprised. He opened the door with a quiet, "You're late." They told him there was no record of Unit 231. No official proof he was ever deployed. No files, no medals, nothing. Walter nodded. Then he walked into his back room and returned with an old crumpled piece of canvas, half-burned, dirt-stained. He laid it out on the table. It was a field map, hand-marked with grease pencil notations, initials, radio call signs, and one sharply drawn triangle with a star, and the numbers 231 circled in red ink. He flipped it over. On the back, a faded list of transmission codes, handwritten. He pointed to one entry. "I memorized this code because it saved our lives. You people wrote it. I just didn't forget it like you did." They were quiet. One of the agents picked up the canvas and examined it under a small UV light. Another pulled out a folder. Not a laptop, not a tablet, but an actual folder, and compared the markings to something inside. And for the first time in 70 years, someone finally said it. "We need to escalate this." That was all Walter needed to hear. He didn't want a medal. He didn't want a press release. He just wanted someone to stop pretending it never happened. That night, Elliot called him. "They believe you now," Elliot said. Walter paused, then replied, "Good, but this ain't about me." The room was quiet long before the ceremony began. It was not a grand hall. There were no banners, no brass band playing patriotic hymns, and certainly no media coverage. Just a plain room off the west wing of the Federal Military Museum, a place more used to cleaning supplies than commemoration. They said it had to be small. They said parts of it are still classified, but those who mattered were there, and the one who mattered most had finally been invited. Not by command, but by acknowledgement. Walter Hagan arrived early. He wore the same coat, the same scuffed boots, and the same olive cap with the faded, unrecognized insignia. A man who, for 70 years, had lived in the footnotes of history, if that. He walked in slowly. The room was dimly lit. No speeches playing from a loudspeaker. No PowerPoint presentations. Just a single spotlight aimed toward the centerpiece of it all. The Sherman tank. Clara, restored, cleaned, but untouched where it mattered. Still bearing the scar just beneath her turret. Still marked by the bullet that had once changed the fate of Martinez and of Walter himself. The tank sat like an old witness, waiting patiently for someone to remember her for what she truly was. The small crowd stood in silence as Walter approached. There were maybe 20 people in the room, a few Department of Defense officials in plain suits, the museum's curator, a military historian from Georgetown, Elliot standing near the back with his notebook clutched to his chest, and a few uniformed soldiers who hadn't even been born when Walter's boots last touched foreign soil. No one said a word as he reached the tank. Walter rested his hand gently against the steel, not ceremonially, but like greeting an old friend. He let it sit there for a moment, his eyes closed. Maybe in that moment, he saw more than the rest of them could. The dust, the smoke, the desert sun. Maybe he heard voices that only he remembered. Then from the other side of the room, footsteps approached. It was a young soldier, early 20s, army dress blues, polished shoes, a neatly pressed uniform. Walter had never met him, didn't know his name, didn't need to. The soldier stopped 3 feet in front of the old man, stood at full attention, and with crisp precision, raised his hand in a slow, respectful salute. No one moved. No one breathed. The moment hung in the air like a prayer. There were no words exchanged. The salute wasn't rehearsed, and no one had instructed him to do it. It wasn't part of the schedule, but it was everything the ceremony needed to be. Walter didn't return the salute. He simply looked the young man in the eyes, nodded once. A quiet, solemn gesture. One soldier to another, one generation recognizing another. The kind of unspoken connection that doesn't need explaining. The room stayed still for a long moment after that. Then Walter turned slowly and walked away from the tank. He didn't linger. He didn't soak in the attention. He just passed by the rows of quiet faces, most of them unfamiliar, all of them deeply moved. As he reached the door, someone gently asked, "Mr. Hagan, is there anything you'd like to say?" He paused, turned back, and with a calm, unwavering voice said, "I don't need a medal. I don't need a ceremony. I just need one thing. Don't let them be forgotten." And with that, he walked out. Outside, the air was brisk, clear, the kind of morning light that makes even concrete feel honest. Walter stood for a moment, looked up at the flag flying high above the museum, then placed his cap back on his head. Elliot caught up to him on the steps. "You changed something today," the young historian said. Walter gave a half smile. "Did I?" Elliot nodded. "They'll remember now, because of you." Walter didn't look at him, just kept his eyes on the horizon. "They won't remember me," he said, "but maybe they'll remember the ones I left behind." "That's good enough." The two stood in silence. No camera flashes, no podium, just a tank, a gesture, and the man who outlasted erasure. Walter Hagan never asked to be remembered. He never sought medals, titles, or headlines. He didn't care about parades or public ceremonies. What he did care about, deeply, quietly, was memory. Not just his own, but the memory of men who stood beside him and never made it home. The ones who had no graves, no names carved in stone, no official page in a dusty archive. And perhaps that's the most powerful truth of all. Because in the end, the worth of a soldier, of any human being, isn't defined by medals or records, but by what they were willing to endure, protect, and sacrifice for. It lies in what they stood for when no one was watching, and what they carried long after the world turned the page. Walter's story reminds us that history is not only written in books. Sometimes it's etched in faded tattoos. Sometimes it hides in an old man's quiet gaze. Sometimes it rides in the echo of tank tracks no longer heard, but never truly gone. The silence Walter lived in wasn't just absence, it was consequence. His life became a question that no one wanted to answer. And yet, by choosing to return to that museum, by laying a hand on that cold steel one last time, he reopened a forgotten chapter. He gave voice to the invisible, presence to the erased, and now we, the listeners, the viewers, are part of that story too. So ask yourself, how many more men like Walter are walking quietly among us today? How many are sitting alone at diners, standing at the edges of parades, wearing caps with fading insignias no one recognizes? How many stories have we missed because we never asked? And perhaps more importantly, if you had the chance to write one name into the pages of history, not a famous one, not a general or a politician, but a forgotten one, who would you choose? Let's bring this to you, the viewers. We want to hear your voice. Have you ever met someone, a neighbor, a stranger, a relative, whose quiet presence made you wonder what they'd been through? Have you ever regretted not asking someone about their story while you had the chance? If you could honor just one unsung hero in your life, who would it be and why? Please share it in the comments below. Let this section become a wall of remembrance, not just for Walter, but for every person who carried their history in silence. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you haven't thought about in years, maybe today is the day to pick up the phone, to ask, to listen, before that story fades forever. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you believe stories like Walter's deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing to the channel, giving the video a like, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the loudest truths come from the quietest people.